Hello, everybody. Welcome to the replacement lecture on the appendicular skeleton. This is chapter 8 in your textbook. And once you listen to this lecture, take a look at the lecture slides and some additional images, you'll see that we are covering a very similar material that you already have taken a practical on. So this is all very familiar. If I can say just one thing, please hold on to all those terms from your practical. Will be very handy, gives you a leg up in your preparation for lecture exam 3. So in the chapter version of the appendicular skeleton, we start with the pectoral girdle. This is maybe a little more detailed description of what we had in the lab. You notice that in the lecture portion of this material, joints start to gain more and more ground. And here we are naming the anatomical Latin name of the joints, where the clavicle articulates with the manubrium portion of a sternum. And you'll see this kind of naming time after time. In your joint chapter, we have a huge table about all these names. What you're saying basically is the joining bones give the name to the anatomical joint. Now, don't mistaken with this with the joint types. The joint types will be coming to you, that kind of classification, and whether it's a fibrous, cartilaginous, or a planar, or condyloid, or so on. Those types are classification based on structure and mobility. These ones, just the names, where basically the Latin name of these bones are put together. You'll see this in most cases. The scapula is held in place by muscle. We kind of refer to this in the lab because we mentioned oodles of muscle attachment sites, and you'll see your favorite, I'm sure, if you had the infraspinous fossa as your favorite muscle attachment site on the scapula. Yes, we have it here. If you happen to have the coracoid process on the scapula as your favorite muscle attachment site, yes, we're not leaving that out. So the terms will be very similar here. Excuse me for a minute. Sorry, I had to sneeze. So the shoulder joint also has a Latin name. The glano part, as you all remember from a scapula, the glanoid cavity, that gives the glano part to this glenohumeral joint. And you all know this too by joint type. That was a ball and socket joint. So let's take a look at clavicle and scapula as the first two bones here on our list today. Those two bones make up the pectoral girdle. Here is an artistic rendition of the clavicle. You can see this strategic location articulating with the sternum at the sternal end and with the acromion portion of the scapula on the acromial end. And the clavicle is just very conveniently almost resting on the first rib here. We do have a ligament that secures the clavicle to this first rib. Our body is making a great deal of effort to stabilize this portion of the body. The clavicle has no other articulations except to the highly movable scapula or to the sternum. The scapula, and you can see this peeking out as the acromion portion, but you can see behind the ribs the vertebral border. You can kind of see the armpit side axillary border as well, and you can kind of see the glenoid cavity here articulating with the head of the humerus. In the muscle labs, we will mention in 2 labs how the scapula is stabilized. In Chapter 11, when we talk about just a little bit about muscle gross anatomy, we will mention a group of muscle called fixators that stabilize certain structures, and the scapula needs to be stabilized big time. Otherwise, the weight of the arm and anything that's in our hand would just pull the scapula down all the way to our hip. So lots of muscles, and this is the reason why we have many muscle attachment sites on the scapula. This is the look we get at the scapula. I know in the lab we had both the anterior and the posterior surface. Here we're looking at very, very familiar structures such as the scapular spine, and the extreme end of that is the acromion. This is where the clavicle articulates. Of course, we have the borders. We do have the supraspinous fossa, infraspinous fossa as muscle attachment site. From this unusual angle, from the angle of the humerus, you do see the coracoid process best as muscle attachment site. And here's that word famous glenoid cavity or glenoid fossa that articulates with the head of the humerus. To the scapula is attached, articulates the humerus. So we'll be looking at all these bones and the joints. Again, the list of the terms are very, very familiar. As long as you're prepared for the practical. So on the proximal epiphysis of the humerus, we see the head highlighted by this bluish layer of articular cartilage over the articulating surface. So the head of the humerus is sitting right in the glenoid cavity. Maybe this is the best angle to show you both the scapula and the humerus at their articulating point. We do have muscle attachment sites. I mentioned this in the lab too. The lesser and greater tubercles. And on this image, we also have the deltoid tuberosity as well as a muscle attachment site. I just want to show you a variety of joint replacement surgeries, because all those bones articulations are taking closer and closer to Chapter 9, the joint chapter. So here's an X-ray of a humerus, and you can see the nice round head sitting in the glenoid cavity here. This is the shoulder replacement surgery when the glenoid cavity may have been stabilized, but the head of the humerus have been replaced by an implant. As you can notice, it's not visible real well, but the greater and lesser tubercles are left in place because we still need those muscles. And here's a kind of unusual reverse shoulder replacement where the ball, in this ball and socket joint, the ball is screwed into the scapula and the socket is attached to the humerus. This is just another way to recreate this joint, which is a ball and socket type. Anatomically, it's the glenoid cavity of the scapula, that is the socket, and a head of the humerus, that is the ball. At the distal end, we have seen all these structures in the lab. You can see the articulation side, this round articulation side, the capitulum, and the one with a groove and two ridges, the trochlea. And here you can actually see the articulating bones. The head of the radius is articulating with the capitulum, and the proximal epiphysis of the ulna is articulating at the trochlea of the humerus. We mentioned those muscle attachment sites. Here's this large bony bump. This is the medial epicondyle, and on the side here, on the other side, is the lateral epicondyle. Don't be scared that there are no labels on these images. On lecture exam 3 and not on any kind of lecture exam, you do not see any images. So this is truly just for entertainment purposes, to jiggle your visual memory from that lab material when you think about these names. We mentioned here the olecranon fossa on the posterior distal end of the humerus that, as you can see here really nicely, accommodates the olecranon process of the ulna when we straighten out our elbow. And on this image here is the coronoid fossa on the humerus, and here's the coronoid process, this little lip-like portion of the ulna. And when we bend our forearm all the way, then it is this coronoid process of the ulna that will run into the coronoid fossa of the humerus. This is a kind of unusual look at the elbow joint. It does show you very nicely the coronoid process. Again, imagine this forearm is being bent closer and closer to the shoulder. Then this coronoid process will slide in the trochlea and run eventually into the coronoid fossa. You can also see very nice capitulum and head of the radius articulation. We mentioned this in the lab as well. Here's the artistic rendition of that fibrous type joint, the interosseous membrane between the shafts of the radius and the ulna. And anatomical, information related to the anatomical position. Remember, anatomical position is pointing your palm forward. That means that your thumbs are pointing laterally, and radius is the thumb side bone in the forearm. So because of that anatomical position, the radius is the lateral bone of the forearm, and ulna is the medial bone of the forearm. For the ulna and radius, there is this is a really good look at the distal end from the carpal bone's point of view. You see that the ulna and radius articulates at this point. The ulnar notch on the radius accommodates the head of the ulna, and very close to it there are the articulation sites with those two carpal bones, the scaphoid and lunate, and you can see the nice articulating surfaces. So this is the distal end of the radius. This got a little out of sequence, but I wanted to show you that interosseous membrane on cadaver material. So here's our radius. You can see the head of the radius, nice shiny cartilage covered articulating end. You can see the coronoid process of the ulna. You can see the olecranon, and you can get a somewhat good sense of this curving trochlear notch here. And so here's that magical interosseous membrane. Again, this is very thin. This is just stabilizing our forearm, holds the bones close to each other, doesn't allow much separation. So this is that interosseous membrane between the shaft of the ulna and the shaft of the radius. Talking about carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges, in the lecture material, we are focusing more on connections, and this is a really good view to show you how the head of the ulna articulates with the radius, but not with any of the carpal bones. It's the distal end of the radius that is articulating with the scaphoid and lunate. So it's good to know the names of these two carpals. And also, we also have another famous carpal, the trapezium. This forms that very unique saddle joint, and the trapezium bone is articulating with the metacarpal 1. This is the metacarpal of the thumb. You see the other metacarpals here, numbered, and again, these are the bones in the palm of our hands. These are long bones, no different from radius or ulna or the humerus. You can see the shaft and the proximal and distal epiphyseal areas. So a little curiosity is that just like with the ulna, where the distal end was the head, all the metacarpals have their distal end called the head. So the metacarpal phalangeal joints, which are right here, they form what we call the knuckle portion of the head. So when you make a fist, the phalanges bend, and we create a sharply protruding set of bones, which are the heads of our metacarpals. In terms of the phalanges or digits themselves, all we're going to remember or all we have to remember is there is a total of 14 of them on each hand. Well, this takes us to the pelvic girdle. Here in the lab, we mentioned the coxal bone, and then we moved on to the femur. Here in the lecture, we explore a little more around the anatomical region called pelvis. We didn't mention this in the lab. The pelvis is a curious structure. This was very easy to dissect from cadavers. There are lots of ligaments that holding these bones together, and so it was considered an anatomical unit, the pelvis. And you can see that the appendicular skeleton, the coxal bones, and the exoskeleton, sacrum and coccyx, combine together to form the pelvis. So in the lab, we kind of separated axial versus appendicular skeletal structures. Here, we're going to say a few good words about the pelvis itself. In terms of the appendicular skeleton portion of the pelvis, we have the coxal bones, and here you can see color-coded ilium, ischium in red, and pubis in blue. We mentioned this in lab that all three bones contribute to the formation of the acetabulum, which is the attachment site for the head of the femur to form our hip joint, ball and socket type joint. We do have a number of muscle attachment sites, and it's listed here: the iliac crest, iliac spines, and we saw the anterior superior, anterior inferior, posterior superior, posterior inferior. We do see the iliac fossa here. We didn't have this view of the ilium in the lab. We have to mention the sacroiliac joint, and here is the auricular surface that matches the auricular surface on the sacrum, and the two bones are very solidly attached, and that is called the sacroiliac joint. We also have greater sciatic notch. We mentioned this big indentation on the ilium in the lab as well. This is where sciatic nerve is coursing through. For the ischium and pubis together, and this is the best color-coded view, together they form the obturator foramen. The ischium has its own muscle attachment sites like ischiospine and ischiotuberosity. And the pubis, the most recognizable aspect of the pubis is the pubic symphysis, where the left and right pubic bones meet medially, and a layer of fibrocartilage joins the left and right pubic bones, forming the pubic symphysis. So here is probably the best view of the pubic symphysis. Right here you can see the pubic bones left and right, and here's this fibrocartilage. You also have a good view of the acetabulum on both sides. The entire unit that you're looking here is the pelvis. And of course, as soon as we have pelvis, we have to have some kind of an anatomical distinction to many parts. But first, let's take a look at what anatomists did with this structure. What anatomists decided that this black line that you see started here, that starts at the pubic symphysis, goes onto the ischium, continues on the sacrum, moves along the sacropromontory, and it goes on to the other coxal bone and close the circle. This black line represents the pelvic brim. Okay, what is this good for? Well, the best utility or most recognizable aspect of the pelvic brim is if you look at the sagittal section of this pelvis. Here you see the sacropromontory, this jutting out bony portion of the first sacral vertebra. If you draw a line, and this is this red line, between the sacropromontory and the pubic symphysis, you create a space that is inferior to this red line. So this area marked by this arching arrow is our pelvic cavity. We keep talking about abdominal pelvic cavity. So this is the pelvic portion of our abdominal pelvic cavity. There are some organs that reside here, and those are the true pelvic organs. Things like urinary bladder, ovaries, prostate. Those are all typical pelvic organs because they reside in the pelvic cavity. Many organs reside both in the abdominal and in the pelvic cavity. They are not considered truly pelvic organs. So to drive this point home, anatomists decided that this area marked with this blue shaded area is what we call the true pelvis. And so this huge bony structure has a false part to it. Anything superior to this black line, and this includes the iliac crest left and right, the superior articulating facets on the sacrum, the anterior, superior, inferior iliac spines. That is all part of the false pelvis. And the space that is surrounded by the bony structures of the false pelvis is indicated here in this pink color, and that is now considered the domain of the abdominal cavity. Interesting process that during pregnancy, the uterus is one of those typical pelvic organs, but with the growth of the embryo and fetus, the uterus grows across this line, and at the end of the pregnancy, most of the fetus, and therefore the uterus, this originally pelvic organ, is now in the abdominal cavity. This is the first, I don't want to say it's the only time, but this is the first time that we see sex-related differences in gross anatomy. The pelvis is clearly structured along different dimensions in male versus female. The angle of the pubic arches is measured, and if this arch opens up to greater than 90 degrees, that's a typical measurement for the female pelvis. And if the angle is narrower, that's a typical measurement for the male pelvis. If you look at the area of the pelvic brim, which is surrounding the pelvic inlet, this is larger in females than males. This has a lot to do with accommodating the growing fetus during pregnancy. If we could look at the size of the pelvic outlet, that is also larger in females because that is along the birth canal during delivery. Males have a narrower pelvic outlet. The programming of this comes from the testosterone made in utero by the developing male fetuses. Female developmental pattern is the default. This changes only if there is testosterone present in the uterus, and the male fetuses make their own testosterone. Leads to other changes as well, but here in the development of the pelvis, this reflects probably the most striking fashion. So here's one aspect of at least some of the structures that we mentioned already. In the exoskeleton, we mentioned the sacrum, and here's that sacral promontory. During pelvic examination, this can be palpated, and so during labor and delivery, the movement of the head of the fetus along these lines represent passing through stations of delivery. And station -3, I believe this is associated with the beginning of labor, some stirring in the uterine activity. Station -3 is nothing else but the pubic symphysis is connected with a line to the sacral promontory. So in addition to being part of the anatomical definition of the true and false pelvis, sacral promontory is also an anatomical landmark to decide the beginning of labor and delivery process, the movement of fetus. What's joining the coxal bone? We've seen this in the slab, head of the femur, and we're going to talk about, yet again, very familiar set of structures here. I'm going to switch to the image, but when you look at these structures, the trochanters, linea aspera, gluteal tuberosity, condyles, head of the femur, we're mentioning familiar structures here from the lab. So on this image, here's the head of the femur, again part of that ball and socket joint, matching up with the acetabulum. We do see the greater and lesser trochanters here, but you can see them here as well in the posterior view. You see that world famous gluteal tuberosity, a little bit distal to the greater trochanter, and the linea aspera, this strong line, posterior side of the femur. So trochanters, tuberosity, linea aspera, all muscle attachment site. And we'll be seeing this on the tibia as well, but good to point out on this whole femur that we do have condyles for articulation with the tibia, the medial and lateral condyles, and we do have a set of muscle attachment sites, the medial and lateral epicondyles of this femur. This is yet another X-ray of a replacement surgery. This is one-sided hip replacement surgery. It's just good to know that when you hear or say hip replacement surgery, it's not that our entire hip, not our entire pelvis that is being replaced. It's just the hip joint. Here is the original or the untouched hip joint, and you can see the very nice socket of the acetabulum. You can see the head of the femur, you can see the neck of the femur, you can see the greater, lesser trochanters. And once the surgery is done, as it was done on this side, the neck and head of the femur disappeared. The greater and lesser trochanters remained with all their muscles attached, and the head of the femur is replaced by this titanium or Teflon implant that is hammered into the shaft of the femur. In the lab, we said absolutely nothing about the patella, and we'll be very close to that in lecture as well. Maybe the most important and repeat information here, this is a sesamoid bone. Some time ago, I showed everyone an X-ray of a newborn, or maybe it was a 3-month-old newborn, 3-month-old baby, and patella was nowhere to be found, not calcified anyway. So this is a sesamoid bones developing tendons under stress, and walking and running is the stress that toddler or youngster will need to create bone development in the patella. For the tibia, we have a good look at the distal end of the femur with its femoral condyles and how those femoral condyles articulate with the condyles of the tibia. Here is another good look of the fibula, which is articulating with the tibia. Fibula does not reach the femur for articulation, so tibia is the only load-bearing, weight-bearing bone of the leg. We mentioned this in the lab, tibial tuberosity. It will come back in the muscle labs yet again, major muscle attachment site. And of course the tibia forms the medial malleolus, and this is a good part of our ankle and ankle joint. For the fibula, it's important to point out it's not part of the knee joint, because the knee joint is just between the femur and the tibia. Fibula remains inches away from making contact with the femur. Most notable aspect of the fibula is that it forms the lateral malleolus, the lateral aspect of our ankle joint. I want to show you yet another cadaver exposure. Here we have now the tibia and the fibula. You can kind of notice the head of the fibula, the lateral malleolus. A tibia is a little bit hiding many of the surface markings, but I wanted to show you the interosseous membrane. Yet again, just like between the radius and ulna, between the shaft of the tibia and shaft of the fibula, we have this thin connective tissue membrane to stabilize the two bones next to each other. When it comes to tarsals, metatarsals, and phalanges, we have a very similar set of information yet again to the lab. And so we have 7 metatarsals, and we have the biggest one, the calcaneus, and this is the look from below. Maybe we should go to this look, because this has a nice articulation site right here. So calcaneus is our heel bone, and right on top of that heel bone is the bone, the tarsal bone that is world famous for articulation, the talus. The talus bone, as you can see, here's the nice articulation for the tibia, and it's medial malleolus, and here on the lateral end is the articulation site with the fibula. So this is the place where the lateral malleolus articulates. In terms of the metatarsals, we have a little more explicit numbering, 1 through 5. We mentioned this much in the lab, is that the thickest metatarsal bone is the metatarsal of the big toe, and that's number 1. And the numbering goes 1 through 5, and 5 is the metatarsal of the pinky toe. In terms of phalanges, we have 14 on each foot, very similar to the phalanges or digits on each hand. And the last thing to talk about the arches of the foot. So with our metacarpals and metatarsals, we needed relatively little stabilization. When we get to the joint lecture, you'll see a few insightful images of just how that's done with the large number of ligaments and articular capsules between the carpal bones. But in our foot, this is a different area. This portion of our body receives a tremendous impact and tremendous force. Even if we are just standing, the force of gravity is pulling our entire weight down onto the talus, and so distribution of this weight and stabilization of the bones of the foot is the purpose behind the arches of the foot. So the arches are made by ligaments and tendons. So these are ligaments and tendons. If you think back to the tissue chapter, dense, regular connective tissue, very highly resistant to pulling forces as long as the force is coming in the direction of the pulling. So we have longitudinal arch, and we have transverse arch as well. So this arching appearance of our tarsals and metatarsals are stabilized by these tendons and ligaments. Excessive standing, or in some individuals, or especially in the elderly, the weakening of these ligaments leads to the flattening of this arch. Now, at first, it makes no difference whether we have an arch or is it flat, but nerves and blood vessels run on top and in between these bones, assuming that they receive the proper space when the arch is maintained. When the arch is flattened, nerves can be pinched or pressured, and that could create numbness or the feeling of fatigue. Muscles can be stretched, and a stretch muscle try to contract, but eventually it gets tired. It also gives us the feeling of fatigue. If blood vessels are partially obstructed, pinched, then less oxygen and nutrients will come to the bones, ligaments, and muscles. And so all that adds up to the feeling of being tired, that I can't stand a minute on my foot. I'm just so tired. It's an interesting perception when we go to the nervous system. We talk about incoming sensory nerve impulses a little more, and this is definitely telling us that we have overloaded one or another aspect of this arch, and maybe time to sit down or time to rest the foot. So this is the end to this appendicular skeleton lecture. A chapter quiz will be opening on this chapter 8. Please keep an eye on these small assignments. And before lecture exam 3, we have only the joint chapter. So now that you are done with practical 2, if you have disposable time, maybe you can start reviewing for the lecture exam 3. Bone physiology was quite a few weeks away on our schedule. So I'm going to stop here, and I'll be attaching this to your class shell.